I've just revealed my top 3 of the year.
Okay.
In this order.
Okay. All right. So we'll see if that lines up with mine when we get to that point.
It's a fun little experiment. We've never done it this way.
Never done it this way, but we've never had video before. So this is
That's
a
true.
way to, introduce
this podcast is going to go pretty long now, isn't it?
Yeah. For those on the audio side of this, I do apologize. But, go watch
hopefully the
video
banter's
on
still
YouTube.
good, right? Yeah. If it's still fun to listen to, then we're at least doing something right. But maybe it'll provoke you all to go to our YouTube page and actually see what we, how we look doing this crap.
At least for that portion of it, because I don't want there to be any accusations. So now that there's video,
there's evidence.
Before we get to it, before Brendan and I have talked about it, we have not shared these lists at all. I have no idea what is going to be on his list.
Mm-hmm.
But I do
and I still have it here. So I'm putting my pen away. So this way our watchers on YouTube know I'm not making changes to it mid-show just to match up to any prediction. So it's right here. It's right here, and I'll pick it up when we get to that moment of the show. All right, so that leaves our top 3s, right? That's all that's left. So I guess I was right. We have the same top 3. It's just a different order.
Yes. So the audience knows your top 3 in order.
Should I show it again just to reiterate? Do you want to block your eyes?
Okay. All right. I'll block myself here.
Let me get it closer in case our listeners can't quite read my handwriting, but that's what it is. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Can I guess the order?
Go ahead. You can guess the order.
So I don't know the order. This is my guess for Brendan. At number 1 is AI, artificial intelligence.
Okay.
At number 2 is In the Mood for Love. And at number 3, The Royal Tenenbaums.
All right. This is what I wrote.
I'm a little bit surprised. Okay. I'm a little surprised.
Now, I will say, in actuality, my numbers 2 and 3 are really 2A and 2B. You're not wrong in many ways, JD, because I originally did have that order. It was our conversation just yesterday as we're recording this that maybe temporarily pushed the Royal Tenenbaums to my number 2. Okay. Now, could that switch between In the Mood for Love and Royal Tenenbaums once again? Maybe. But the fact of the matter is we're talking about 3 all-timers right now.
Yes.
We really are. Now, if I were to guess, now they're your top 3 as well, right?
Uh-huh.
All right. Your order, I assume, is number 1, Royal Tenenbaums.
Mm-hmm.
Number 2, AI, and number 3, In the Mood for Love.
Yes.
That's
it. My order. Yep.
All right. So I guess we'll start with In the Mood for Love, which we have reviewed on the show. Technically, the InSession Film Podcast has reviewed twice.
Because you and I did a review, and then Ryan and Jay did one during their Wong Kar-wai series.
Yeah.
So there's 2 reviews that anyone listening to this, if you want to go and hear any of them, they're certainly available there at InSessionFilm.com. But yeah, I mean, it's one of the most evocative romantic films of all time.
Yeah. Yeah.
The performances.
So good. So it's one of the best shot films I think I've ever seen.
Here is just
Christopher Doyle.
Stunning.
Oh my gosh, what wonderful work! It's
so good.
One of the most beautiful soundtracks coupling this quote unquote romance. I just, you know me, JD. I love movies like this. These are like these romantic what if movies. What I think is just so great about this one is it's kind of an anti-romance in some ways.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, I think I heard that the original draft did have our 2 lead characters sleeping together, and I'm so glad it does not go that route.
I agree.
Because the whole point of this movie is how they are struggling to not act on their romantic impulses.
They do not indulge in it, at least not physically.
Yeah, I mean, they sort of play with it in an almost like fetishistic way by reenacting their own spouses being unfaithful to them and how that could play out. So there is kind of a fetishistic quality to their relationship, but there also is this relatability in what they're both going through. But it also speaks to the cultural and political times that this takes place in, where
Yes.
acting on these impulses would not only get you in trouble, it would get you ostracized.
Hmm.
And that's something that I think Wong Kar-wai is demonstrating here. Again, it also helps that you've got two amazing performances. Tony Leung and Maggie Cheung are wonderful, absolutely wonderful here.
Absolutely. I echo everything you're saying. It's this incredible reflection on the socio-political tensions of their world in the early 60s, but it's ultimately this romantic film about human longing
Yeah.
and this desire for love. And you center that through this incredible irony where their spouses cheated on each other
Yeah.
and left. And it's left them in this weird space where they could do the same thing in the aftermath of it. And maybe
Mm-hmm.
there's a murkiness there because they're technically not with their partners anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what makes it strange, maybe a little bit taboo, and why they don't indulge in it. Again, at
Yeah,
least not physically, but emotionally, there's absolutely a murkiness to it all.
for sure.
And man, does Wong Kar-wai emphasize and
Oh my
tease
god.
us with that romanticism in these
He
incredible
does it
blistering
visually.
ways.
There is this sexiness to the film in the way that it
Yes.
utilizes slow motion, the music, as we alluded to already, the cinematography by Christopher Doyle, the tight spaces. This almost feels like a prison movie at times. The
Yeah.
way people are almost claustrophobically framed and boxed in.
Hmm.
So when characters walk down a hallway and they have to brush
Oh my
past each other,
gosh.
there's almost
Oh,
it almost
it's
turns into a
so
gesture.
provocative.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
No,
love it.
I love it as well. And so, yeah, the whole time it's almost as if you're salivating for them to indulge in that romance. Wong
Yeah.
Kar-wai is certainly giving us that tease. And because of how he writes these characters, how they're performed, we do empathize with them. We understand this yearning for each other, and obviously them grieving, trying to cope, trying to understand all of this.
Yep.
And but even though the film, the characters never, they don't give us what we want in that regard, but that's what makes it so compelling, is that we understand why they don't, and
Yep.
we would have understood if they did. Like
Yeah.
it kind of goes both ways, but from a cinematic perspective, it's just exquisite to watch.
It
It's
is.
incredible.
Wonderful film. So then that leaves our top two, which are the same top two, just switched for both of us.
Mhm.
Um, do we need to talk about them really in detail? I mean, we already
No.
gave a full review of the Royal Tenenbaums already, which is available now
Mhm.
on all of our streaming platforms that you can go and check out. We talked about that movie for what, almost 2
An
hours.
hour and 40 minutes.
There it is. There it is.
Yes.
That's a
An
full
hour and
podcast
40
episode,
minutes.
and that was just on that movie.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
There
it was
was
worth it. It was worth
there
it.
was a little bit of pretext in how we talked about Wes Anderson and how we felt about that film before this exercise. So
Mhm.
the review really kicks in about 15 minutes into that
But even
episode.
so, we kind of tailored those opening thoughts with the Royal Tenenbaums, or at least I
Yeah.
kind of did. So I
Yeah.
got into
Yeah.
my thoughts with it pretty early, and I still stand by thinking that this is perhaps not just the best directed Wes Anderson film as far as tone management, like we talked about, but in many ways, kind of the definitive definition of a
Mhm.
Wes Anderson film. It
Mhm.
has the early qualities of his more indie roots, but with those dollhousey vibes that he would really dive headfirst into in his later films. It
Mhm.
just it's like a Wes Anderson buffet all rolled into one movie. And
Yeah.
that could be a recipe for disaster. It could almost be insufferable because of
Yeah.
that. But it's not. It's a beautiful movie.
Absolutely. It's incredible. I do have that here as my number one. I won't get into it too much because, again, just go listen to that episode. But for those that haven't had a chance to listen yet, I will just reiterate, as much as I love Wes Anderson and he's one of my favorite filmmakers working today, it is
Mhm.
my favorite Wes Anderson. It's one of my favorite films of all time. And I think what really draws me to it is that it has that quirkiness, it has the eccentricity of Wes Anderson. It's very funny,
Yeah.
but at the core of that film is this deep, palpable sorrow, this
Yeah.
melancholy that just lingers over every frame. And I love that tonal balancing act. It is truly mesmerizing. Very few filmmakers have been able to capture the levels and extremes that Wes Anderson evokes in that film, and the performances are just incredible. We talked about Luke Wilson quite a bit on that
Yeah,
episode.
we talked about him a lot. Yeah,
We really
he was kind of the
did.
star of that podcast.
It's his best performance, and it's an underrated performance because people don't really talk about it all that much, but it's truly one of the best of that year. Ben Stiller, of course, is really great. Gene Hackman gives one of the best performances maybe ever. Like
Well,
it's just that good, I think.
yeah, we talked about that. I think we both agreed that it's the best performance of 2001, Gene
Yes.
Hackman's performance.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I really love that film and love what it's aiming for, and it's something West just simply hasn't gone back to until Asteroid City. He does
Yeah, which carries some of
circle
that
back to that a
melancholy.
little
Yeah.
bit, but yeah, Royal Tenenbaums I just adore with every fiber of my being. So it
Oh,
is
yeah.
my number one, but my number
Yeah.
two, which is obviously Brendan's number one, is it's interesting how
Hmm.
this is the film that maybe most quintessentially circles back to what we mentioned at the beginning of this conversation in terms
Yeah.
of reevaluation.
Yep.
Because in 2001, I wouldn't say that this was beloved, certainly not to the
No.
degree we're talking about it here.
No.
And maybe even 10 years ago, it really hadn't quite reached the heights it does now. But I do think its reputation is very different now than it was 10, 20 years ago.
Agreed.
People do think of this as Spielberg operating, and I think it's because look, we're coming off the heels, we're not too far removed from something like Saving Private Ryan,
Hmm.
or even a few years before that, Schindler's List, or you look at his stuff in the 80s. This is a very different Spielberg when we get to something like
This era
AI.
of Spielberg is so fascinating because
It
he still
is,
taps into this cynicism of sorts, this coldness, this bleakness that also would bleed into movies like Minority Report or War
yes,
of the Worlds. Munich, another great example that's not too far removed from this era.
yeah,
It's a very different Spielberg. It's not necessarily an era where I think he's making the greatest films of his career in totality, but it's him at his most fascinating.
mhm.
Although I do think AI is maybe his.
Look,
It's so hard to say. I think
don't.
AI is his best movie because I feel like that spot should be reserved for something that is solely Spielbergian, like E.T., right? Like that is a Spielberg film through and through, and AI
Yeah.
is, of course, a collaborative effort. And I think what makes the film so fascinating, why there's nothing else like it, is because of that synergy between Steven Spielberg and Stanley Kubrick. And
Mhm.
and and their respective DNAs are both in the movie. It just turns into a Spielberg film because he was obligated to direct it
Yeah.
after Kubrick's passing.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up ET because I think this is a captivating answer to something like ET, which
Sure.
ends
It's
in
kind of a yin
this
and yang to that.
hopeful, more emotional, sentimental way that I love. ET is a classic and one of Spielberg's best. This is wholly juxtaposed to
Yeah.
that. When you look at David, who is, I guess, the ET character here, and what we get in AI is brutal. It is extremely bleak.
Oh my gosh.
And that's hard to wrap your mind around because it is Spielberg. And at this
Yeah.
point in his career, Saving Private Ryan had perhaps it had its melancholy. It certainly was. It's a war movie, so there's violence and there's sorrow to it, but
Hmm.
not like you could almost argue that for all of the brutality of of Saving Private Ryan, and that opening is quite graphic. And I still think that AI is maybe more brutal. Like it's more harrowing to
Yeah.
watch. At
Oh my.
least, you can make that argument
You can't.
because
I think
emotionally it's so devastating.
it's one of the bleakest movies ever made, and we
It
talked
really
about that
is.
extensively when we reviewed the film. Another film that we've reviewed on the podcast during our Spielberg movie series. This was episode 478, and I think it was one of my favorite conversations we've ever done.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just the detail that we went into. We almost kind of storyboarded that review talking about it because we made our way to that controversial ending and really talked about why we think both of those sensibilities of these directors, Kubrick and Spielberg, work perfectly for that ending to create this facade of happiness when that's anything but what it is. Like
Yeah.
I love that. I love the way it taps into grief, especially from the perspective of a child. If you want to even consider David a child, um, I just simply think I I do think AI might be the greatest movie ever made. I seriously
Oh,
think
wow.
I get that close whenever I think about this movie. I
Okay.
really
Wow.
we're at least talking about a film that's in my top 5 favorites. So maybe I'm skewing it because I have such a personal relationship to it, but I don't know. I'm it's getting harder to convince me otherwise that it should be in the conversation for one of the greatest movies ever made.
It's really great. It's certainly one of the best films of 2001. It's one of the best films of the 2000s.
Mhm.
And I guess spoiler alert for our best of the decade episode. This film will
Spoiler alert
certainly
for
be
our best of the decade.
represented.
It's my number 1.
Yeah, it will be represented for sure.
Yeah.
And I'm with you. I think it's such an interesting film in the context of Spielberg's
Yeah.
filmography because there really isn't much because for all the brutality of Saving Private Ryan and you see how that film ends, and I do love that film much more than you do, but I
Yeah.
do think it harkens back to an idea and perhaps a sentimentality that is 80s 90s Spielberg.
Mhm.
This to me is a completely different guy.
Mhm.
This is a way more cynical, way more uh pessimistic Spielberg
Oh, for
that
sure. Yeah.
that we just hadn't seen yet. And it is, but it's incredible. Like the craftsmanship and the artistry here is still as impressive as ever
Yeah.
with Spielberg, but he's tapping into an emotional agency that is just brand new to him. That would follow with some of the other films that Brendan noted earlier.
Yeah.
But it starts here. It starts with AI,
It really
and
does. Yeah, it's a
I
good
love
point.
it. It's incredible. It to me it is one of his best movies, hands
Yeah.
down,
Yeah.
not even close.
Top 3 at the very least.
Yeah,
Number 1 for me.
absolutely.